Hello, folks, and welcome to this Supreme Court case introduction video. In this video, we'll be covering two Supreme Court cases, that is Baker versus Carr and Shaw versus Reno. Now, these are both cases about the complex process of redistricting. Redistricting is that puzzling process where Congress people get to, as some would say, pick their voters. They're putting together all of the pieces. They're looking at population and districts and how the state should be cut up and rearranged into different pieces. And sometimes we see these crazy shapes. You see, redistricting is one of the core debates surrounding American politics and elections. And so it's an interesting topic because we do return to it a few times throughout the year. Of course, we hit it when talking about Congress, and then again when we hear about the election system, and particularly some of the struggles of third parties. But what is redistricting really? Well, if you've never played the redistricting game or you don't remember from when we did that in class, I would highly encourage you to do that. Just Google search redistricting game, play it for an hour or two, and you are going to have a much better grasp on what this is. You see, it's the process of creating boundaries for House districts, but it's intimately related, as we'll see, to population, to the racial breakdown of people, and to things like geography. It also matters, of course, what state we're talking about. A state like Wyoming doesn't need to redistrict because there is only one congressional district. A state like California, with more than 50 congressional districts, well, they're going to have some debates over how to slice up that California pie. As we said, it really is piecing together and rearranging a puzzle, and it's not at all clear how this should be done in a way that pleases everyone and is fair to everyone. Even people that study this for a living don't really have solidified ideas or wide-scale agreement as to how this should be done. It's just that puzzling. But there are two things we can agree on for sure, and they really are in contention with each other. First off, it's that redistricting can make people's votes count unequally. If I have a district that is entirely of the countryside and a district of only the city, well, those districts are going to have different populations, aren't they? And if we do that, the people in the countryside, let's say there's 100 of them, well, they're 1/100th of the say. And the people in the city, let's say there's 1,000,000 of them, well, their power is much less prevalent. Their power is much more diluted in comparison to the whole. You can imagine if you were going to be deciding on where to go to lunch, you would rather be, in a group of 3 friends than a group of 100 friends if you really had a place in mind you wanted to go. Decision-making power can be easily, unequal if we have unequal sizes of groups that are responsible for making decisions. Now, on the other hand, we have this sense in which, for most of our history, and most people would say, if you give the Constitution a good read as to how districts are set up, that redistricting is the job of elected politicians. And of course, we know elected politicians have a particular interest that they want to stay in power. Without things like term limits on Congress members and the fact that members of the House of Representatives are running for re-election every 2 years, which is certainly a high task, well, we realize that they are going to have some incentives to do that redistricting in a way that benefits them, not in a way that prioritizes equity or equality. So we automatically have tension and contention when we think about redistricting. A couple of cases are really helpful to unpack this. The first is a 1962 case of Baker versus Carr. The long and short of it is that Tennessee hadn't redistricted in 60 years. They just hadn't redrawn their boundaries. Over time, the cities grew, and the people in the countryside, well, that population had in many cases dwindled or stagnated. The result was those very same uneven districts I was describing earlier. You had people in the countryside with enormous power, and people in the city whose power was rather diluted. Now, the Supreme Court didn't want to touch this case. This is political. This is about the job of politicians, isn't it? But in the end, after much wrestling and many arguments, well, the Supreme Court did decide to rule, and they ruled that Tennessee's refusal to redistrict was unconstitutional. They used the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Said the Equal Protection Clause, we know, also matters for people's votes. If citizens are voting, their vote should have equal power. We each get one representative in the House of Representatives, and I should have not have more of a say for my representative than you do. See, at the end of the day, this was the solidifying of a doctrine that had been floating around for a few years now and would be reaffirmed in a few later cases, and that's the doctrine of one person, one vote. Proportionally, my vote should be equal to yours, no matter where we live, no matter our zip code. And so this was a big step in solidifying that, the principle that one person has one vote. In other words, all of our votes are proportional to one another's in terms of power. This would be tested again. In fact, it is really every 10 years when we have redistricting. And in particular, the 1990 Census and Redistricting Commissions had a rather difficult time accounting for changing racial demographics in the United States. Now, in North Carolina, the Democrats saw an opportunity, holding a lot of power at the end of the 1980s. In the 1993 case of Shaw versus Reno, this was tested. See, in the 1980s, North Carolina created a second African-American majority district. Now, it was ruled that North Carolina had to have at least one African-American majority district as a result of things like the Voting Rights Act and historic segregation in the South, including in North Carolina. But in this one, they had to draw a very interesting district that connected two disparate parts of the state with just one little snaky line to create a second African-American majority district. And the Supreme Court said, no, 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 this was unconstitutional. And their evidence, the shape of the district was so bizarre, it could only have been drawn to try to help a certain race. In some ways, the Supreme Court said this also violates the Equal Protection Clause. Congress, the states, anyone in government cannot do something to help or to hinder a certain racial group's voting power. It's just not allowed. What this effectively did was it banned racial gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is redistricting, but with an evil twist. The idea of gerrymandering is redistricting to benefit politicians in power. The Supreme Court said you cannot do that along racial lines. That helps or hinders the powers of a racial group's vote and is not allowed based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, what might you be expected to say about this on that FRQ number 3 about Supreme Court cases? How could you apply these cases? Well, if you ask me, this is the most likely case I think you could get, either Baker versus Carr or Shaw versus Reno, because it's not one that they've asked about before in any previous tests as of 2021. It's not one they've released practice questions on as of 2021. And I think the moneymaker, a big guess for me, is that first one, that the Supreme Court has never ruled against partisan gerrymandering. In the 2010s, this was challenged again and again and even made it to the Supreme Court a few times. The Supreme Court refused to strike down gerrymandering that benefited a political party. Remember, you cannot gerrymander to benefit a specific racial group, but there are some cases, for instance, involving the state of Wisconsin, where the partisan gerrymandering was just so absurd, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that that was okay. Remember, it is elected politicians' right to draw those districts. If you ask me, I think that is the single most likely possibility in terms of things that they haven't used on the AP test for FRQ3. It's fertile ground for a future FRQ. In addition, we have this second issue of justiciability, or whether or not a case is justiciable. And what that means is the Supreme Court debates at length before they start deciding which side they're on, whether they can actually hear a case. And one of the key reasons why the Supreme Court won't take a case is if they deem it too political. That is, it's the job of the people to elect leaders to make policies on this. If it's the job of elected leaders, the Supreme Court often tries to stay out of it. This isn't our business, we stay out of it. The worry is if the Supreme Court becomes too political, then they may lose some of their authority and relevance. And so they're very cautious about what cases they actually can rule on. In this one, particularly in Baker versus Carr, they said, yes, claims about redistricting are justiciable, but as you've seen with those partisan gerrymandering cases, that doesn't mean they're always going to strike down redistricting plans. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this was helpful to you. These are two tough cases, so maybe revisit that redistricting game and see if it helps you make heads and tails of all this stuff. Thanks so much for your time and have a great day.